Okay, so I should start. And Brian is there. Brian,
yes, I am.
You've noticed you're on up as the co-presenter.
Yes, I will do my best.
Because Brian wrote most of the software that you will see and also prepared a lot of the demos and some of the slides. So just chip in whenever I say something that's not quite right.
Okay.
So we've seen some very interesting presentations this morning. Some of them using technology that Dyalog, I think, is going to steal, like the Roomba stuff. And your experience, we're not that far ahead of, or in many cases, we're behind some of what you've seen here this morning. But we're trying to catch up and put it together in a way that's going to be easy for everybody to use. So you won't need to be a trailblazer like some of the people we've seen earlier today. And at the moment, we're basing it around MiServer. How many people here have tried using MiServer? Not that many. Okay. So I think MiServer has been growing for something like 10 years. It started out as a project that Stefano Lanzavecchia built. And then I noodled a bit more with it, but it was still very much a prototype until Brian came along. And in the last couple of years, it's been moving towards becoming really an industrial strength platform. I wouldn't say it's there yet. Somebody asked earlier about documentation. The documentation is still sketchy. But I think it is getting to the point where it's worth taking a look at. Maybe not before Christmas, but certainly just after Christmas. Even the less adventurous of you should be able to have a good experience playing with MiServer. So I think, especially since we have a little bit of time, I'm going to talk a little bit in general about what MiServer is, and then the real title of the talk about the RESTful Web Services. We'll try and do a little workshop at the end. How many people are going to try and do the workshop? Copy the files? Okay, quite a few. So hopefully you'll all be able to get a RESTful server up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what MiServer is, and then REST, and you've already heard some of the reasons why you might want it, and we'll do the workshop. So what is MiServer? Well, primarily MiServer is a way of producing cross-platform user interfaces. That's really been the big motivation for doing the work, because Dyalog users have had this WSDL interface on Windows for what, 20-something years now? And the time has really come to move on. The Win32 APIs, you can still safely create a new application using that. We will be supporting the technology for ages yet. We'll have customers who won't be able to move off this for 15 years, and I think Microsoft will have to, at least on some platforms, continue to make the underlying Win32 API available. But if you're building a new application today, you really want to build it in a way where it could run on other platforms, on Linux, on Mac, on Windows systems, cut down Windows systems that don't have the Win32 API. Microsoft is starting to build server machines, and like they have a version for the Raspberry Pi, I think now, which doesn't have Win32 available. And we need a new technology for making user interfaces. So here's an example of a very, very simple form that you could create with QuadWC. I don't know how many people here have done QuadWC? Nearly everybody. So I don't really need to explain that. We've got a form, a label, an edit, and some output that we produce when you click on the button. And what we've been trying to refine this over and over again to get to the point where we had this keyword EWOC, which Gil mentioned, easy as QuadWC. And if you want to create the equivalent interface now on a web page, here's the code that you have to write. So you have exactly the same components. You need to add a form, give it a title, create. So the label that's one of the nice things, the label is actually attached to the edit field. So you have an edit field and you have a label which you can declare is linked to it. And then you have a button and a callback function. It looks very much the same as before. In fact, if we line them up here next to each other, it's like your Rosetta Stone. So creating the form, in nearly every case, the new code is in fact shorter, which is why I was saying it's easier now, we think, than QuadWC. Of course, you have a whole bunch of new controls to learn if you really want to take advantage of it. But if you just want to build something which is the same as before, I'll color all of these to link them together. The real big difference that you'll notice is that all the numbers have disappeared, right? Because all the new user interface mechanisms, whether you use WPF or HTML and so on, all of the alignment is generally done by using things called stacked panels, where you put things next to each other, and then as the user resizes things, they're automatically moved around and adjusted. So the one thing that I guess is also a bit different is that where before we had a result, we had a text box which we changed the text property of. The common thing to do in when you're using HTML, these so-called AJAX style callbacks, is that you typically replace a named portion of the user interface. So we've got a div here. Let's see, where is it here? A division, an HTML division with the ID result. And in response to the callback to put this text up, we say, well, replace this div with a paragraph containing this text. But I mean, this has really been something where we've had, I don't know how many iterations, Brian, and had them shot down by Gita and other people internally.
A lot.
Sorry, a lot, yeah. Now we're feeling that we're really there. As far as easy as Quad WC is concerned, we are there. So if you want to get hold of it, if you haven't copied stuff off the USB that I sent around, there's a home page now, which is MiServer.Dyalog.com, from where you can download it and see all the code samples. But we're running it as an open source project on GitHub. So let's see if I click on this. It'll take us to GitHub, and from there you can see all the change history. You can see files that have been changed and all the diffs, and you can contribute to the project. We would very much like you to have that. We have 2 or 3 people now external to Dyalog who are contributing to the project. We're really hoping that at least you will contribute code samples, and then maybe the more advanced of you will start contributing new widgets covering functionality that we're not covering yet. So let's actually, you can try and follow this. If you've unzipped the MiServer part of it, but you can also just wait until we get to the time for the workshop. If you load the, shall I maybe increase the font size, or is it okay at the back? A little bit, is that okay? Okay.
It's fine over here.
It's fine over there. So the MiServer, it's a workspace. You load it, and then you call the function start, and as the argument, you give simply a folder name that contains all the files. And by default, as part of the installation, you've got this thing called MS3, which is the same as, exactly the same as what's running on MiServer.Dyalog.com. So whether you go to MiServer.Dyalog.com or you install it, you start MS3 and you go to localhost and open what's on port 8080, you'll get the MiServer self-documenting, we hope, more or less website. So there is some documentation. We've started, there's much better documentation than I think we had for 2.0, and the idea is that by around Christmas time, there'll really be sufficient documentation for anybody to use it. I think there's already enough for adventurous souls to use it. So there's various chapters that are here, currently just in the form of PDF files. There's a very small number of very simple applications that we've built. Whoops, why is this not responding?
Is this not working in 14.1?
I think this should work in both 14.0 and 14.1. Are you having?
Yeah, We have a problem with the IBM 85.
IBM 85, Brian.
Yes, and should work.
Is the version that's? I mean, I've just given everybody a copy of the what's on in GitHub. You have
It should work under everything from 13.2 up.
It's not on 14.1.
It's not working on 14.1. Well, that's what I'm using. Is it classic or Unicode?
Unicode. Sorry, 2 bits.
Okay, well, that's mysterious. We'll look at that when we get to the workshop part. The applications aren't coming up, which is more. Okay, idiom search. So we built a very little sample application where we've taken the FinAPL idiom library and our own Dyalog idioms. So I can search for my favorite is the 2 fighter aircraft flying past each other. So I can search for all the idioms that contain upgrade, downgrade. You see, there are actually 4. There's a kid's keyboard where if you're trying to teach a young kid Hebrew, you can use that. And there's a not very sophisticated tic-tac-toe game, but then more importantly for you, if you're starting to, if you want to build your own applications, you're going to want to look in the controls section. So basically, what we're trying to do now is the same as what we did for what John Daintree did for Quad WC. Is he looked at the Win32 API, and then he built a set of objects. I'm not sure how many we've ended up with in Dyalog now, but it's probably about 100 of what WC-able objects. And we're trying to create a set of widgets that will be as easy to use as those. In the section Dyalog controls, if you expand that, you'll find the 25 or so things that we think are really the basic building blocks of applications. So a button, for example. If you select one of these, you get there's a little section up here which tells you, okay, it's the name of the control is Dyalog control button, what it's for. You click here, it'll take you to a documentation page. You can pop the sample out and run it as a separate page. You can ask to see a related sample, which uses buttons, so other samples which use this control. And then in here is the actual sample, so you can click on that. That's the test application. And then you can scroll down here and say you want to see the source code. And so this is the entire source code for the button sample. So it's a my page, which derives from the my page sample base class, which gives us all these icons and formatting. And then a my page has to have a compose function, which is called once when the page is loaded. And that's where you set up all your GUI. So we have a button with the caption press me, with the ID btn press me. And then we have a callback and an output div. And the callback function does this business of replacing the output. So it's using Ajax style postbacks. It's not posting the page back. It's just sending a message back, and then part of the screen is being updated. So at the moment we have about 20. We have all 25 of these Dyalog controls with samples. We look at the stack panel. So the stack panel is a way of aligning output in a web page. So here we have 3 controls that are aligned vertically. And down here we have the same controls arranged horizontally. And the way that's set up is we create a drop-down and a span containing some text and a button. And then we make a vertical stack panel, adding that array of objects. So you make a new instance of a stack panel with those 3 objects as the argument. And then down here we add a horizontal stack panel with the same objects. And then we end up with the vertical stack panel and the horizontal stack panel. And this is sort of the general way you do your layouts. If we look at the related sample, the advanced stack panel, go to see that page, that's showing a bunch of nested stack panels. So we've got a horizontal stack panel with 3 vertical stack panels inside, and then these objects that just automatically become aligned under each other with various types of margins, padding, no padding here, some padding there, margins, and so on. So that's basically how you control the layout of these pages. Then in addition to the Dyalog controls, as you may know, we have this agreement with a company called Syncfusion, who make third-party controls for a wide variety of platforms. And Dyalog has an agreement with Syncfusion to bundle their set of WPF controls. If you're using .NET to build desktop applications, you've got 120 or something controls to choose from. And then they have a JavaScript library also with about, I think now, about 100 controls. And we've started building APL covers for those. So if you take their accordion control, for example, so an accordion is something where you can have multiple sections and you can open them one by one. We've tried to do a John Daintree on this and build an object called an SFEJ accordion, which is, so we add an accordion with the ID of AC. We set its titles property. Then we create 2 paragraphs. Then we say the sections property of it is P1 and P2. And then as a result of having added that to the My page, all of the HTML and JavaScript that's required for these to appear is automatically generated when the page is output. Yep. And so I won't show you any more of those. You have the whole thing. What's really exciting about this in the longer term, let's see, where did we get to, is that this isn't merely a technology that's useful in this structure that we've seen here, where you have some Dyalog process running. It's running MiServer. It might be running your own. I mean, we have a number of customers, I mean, like Gil, who not really using the MiServer to generate the UI. They're generating Flash, JavaScript, all sorts of other ways to generate the content. And then it's going over the internet and a web browser is rendering it. What we think is a likely way to build applications in the future is that you might jam all of that stuff together on a single machine, which could be Windows, Unix, Mac, Android, Universal Windows, iPhone even. And instead of having the internet in between here, you have an HTML rendering engine that you can just load as a DLL or something like that. But you can have the same interaction going on. So you generate HTML, JavaScript, push it into here. It does whatever it needs to. When the user presses a button, drags something, whatever, you get the same message coming back, an HTTP, maybe a WebSocket thing, maybe a post. But your application logic is exactly the same, whether you're running a web server or you're running a desktop application. And the JavaScript widgets, the things you can embed here, are becoming so good that you can really give the user the same user experience that they're getting today with desktop widgets. So although you think of HTML as a web technology, in the future, I think we're going to see this kind of thing. So at the moment, we're playing with something called the Chromium Embedded Framework. And I can just, let's see, no, I don't want to shut that one down. I'm going to use it. Start a new APL session. So this is just a little workspace we've been playing with. So there's a function here called OpenURL, which takes a URL, the tic-tac-toe page, and a window size and position. And when I run that, I get essentially the same thing as if I had a web browser, except it's inside a normal desktop window. And we're going to, if we can get this to work, we're going to enhance it so that you can take control over all of the Chrome and have menus and stuff under the control of your code. And then we will have the holy grail of a new way of writing applications that will run anywhere. Same user interface technology. And we'll have the replacement for Quad WC for the next 25 years, however long this lasts. The final thing I want to show you about this MiServer is something that I blogged about recently. You already have seen this. So I've got a MiServer running in the background, and I've loaded another MiServer workspace. But instead of starting MS3, I'm going to ask to test MS3. And we've built a mechanism for automating tests, where I'm just going to change this so that after each test delays for, let's say, 2 seconds before moving on to the next one. And then run it. So what this does is it uses something called Selenium, which is sort of the industry standard web automation technology. It starts an instance of Chrome, and then it's now going through the test suite, running each one of those applications, pressing some buttons, typing something into it, verifying that the expected output is appearing. So this is the button, the data list, edit field, field set, which is a collection of fields. This is just an image, I think. Font awesome. Form. Oh, this is if you have an accelerometer in your device. Input grid. I think that was a calendar it was testing there. Various types of validation of numeric input, passwords, rankings. Oh, we've still got some tests that fail. Drag and drop, selection, radio buttons. I'm sort of allowing this to run a bit slowly now so you can get a feel for what's in here. Multi-select lists, drop downs, stack panel advanced.
So this Selenium is the framework for writing test cases for web.
Yeah, it's sort of become the industry standard. It's being supported by all the various web browser makers as well. Google is one of the big people behind this. And it's a very, very simple API where you can basically, because you saw in all the examples that when you create a user interface element, you can give it an ID or a class name or something. The API for this is, well, go and find the thing that has this ID or this class name, type this into it, move the mouse 10 pixels down inside this element, press the button, tell me what's in the text property of this element, and so on. You can access the whole DOM under program control very, very easily. At the moment, we only have it working on Windows because we're using the .NET covers for Selenium. But we're hoping we can find, because the Dyalog APL has a much better .NET interface than it has to any other kind of object framework. We don't have a Java interface. Hopefully we can find a way to drive it perhaps via Python or something like that. What happened?
Sounded like fire alarm.
Yeah, looks like the projector.
Did the projector reset itself?
You're still online. Do we need a fire alarm for that?
Should say fire!
Yeah, blue screen.
Oh, I think I know what happened. I think I know what happened. We must have lost power or something briefly. And then my laptop decided it wasn't there.
Just reselected the HDMI.
If you try disconnecting it.
Physically disconnecting it.
Yeah, to see if it kicks back to life.
Right, you still there?
I'm here. I'm here.
Your PC ran into a problem and needs to restart. We're just collecting some error info and then we'll restart for you. 10% complete. Okay, so, where's the coffee? But questions on this? Because I mean, we're done now, sort of with the basic MiServer introduction, and move on to the web services part of it. I think after this. But what we imagine in the future is that something like this Chromium embedded framework, Dyalog will find to embed that either directly with the interpreter, or we'll build a DLL based on it that you can load and start building applications. Whether you use MiServer or some other way of generating the HTML, you'll be able to use this. Well, our goal is, this is still a research project, that you'll be able to inject HTML, JavaScript into it and get all the callbacks back. My own long-term vision for it, if we can do it, is that you'll also be able to run server-side processes on AIX or a Linux server, generate the HTML, get it tunneled down through to something like our RIDE, and have it generated. So you'll be able to, it'll be just like the mainframe in the good old days, that you'll be able to run mainframe applications that are running logged in under your user ID on a mainframe Unix machine, and have it generating HTML that you can view on an Android phone or an iPhone or whatever, without using IIS or Apache or something like that. Right, now, there might be very good reasons for using Apache, denial of service attacks and security, your corporate load balancing, etc., etc. But if you're just building a single user application, you'll be able to use this kind of technology for that.
I just wanted to inform you that the reason for this little signal was that someone attempted to cook in their flat and apparently set off the fire alarm. So,
What do you mean?
allowed to cook
If you live here, you're not allowed to cook anything.
No. You haven't gone to the restaurant.
Yeah.
It's triggered the generator for some reason. So she will let us know if we have to evacuate.
Where's the
And by the way, the window is open 10 centimeters, I've been informed. Oh, also, they said you'd have to take the stairs.
It's hard to squeeze.
Okay. So let's see if we can. But any questions on the UI side of MiServer? I mean, clearly it needs more documentation. It needs more samples. I mean, that's something where you can really help us, is build some interesting applications.
Lost network access.
Sorry?
You haven't got access to the network.
I haven't got access to the network.
Yeah, I would be surprised if Brian is still there.
Brian, are you still there?
I am still here.
It's a miracle. We sort of lost power on various things here, and my machine crashed, and we're just coming back. So what do I need to do now to...
It's interesting, he wasn't even connected.
Right? Maybe it was the HTML that he said.
I need to go back to...
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
I can't see anything. Is this normal?
Sorry.
I have no picture.
Have you... can you see anything else in the room that you're in?
Oh, good point. Let me turn on the lights for a sec. No, I don't. I can hear you well. I just can't
At
see
the moment,
anything.
I'm not projecting anything because I lost the connection. Somebody needs to make me the presenter.
Yeah,
again.
on it. Just trying to figure out which one of you two
I've done it.
is online. Okay.
Yeah, that could be the reason then.
Everyone has done it.
I am the presenter.
Okay, now I see something. Okay, got it.
Okay, so let's see. Where were we at? We were here. Okay, so essentially, I mean, maybe not MiServer, but certainly this idea of generating HTML5 and JavaScript, we currently think at Dyalog that is, you might as well get used to it. That's the user interface technology that will be current for the next 15 years. What do you say, Sava? 10 or 15 years, HTML, JavaScript. How long will it be with us?
Forever.
Forever.
Next 20.
20. Okay. So as good as Win32. It's the next Win32, I think, if you're thinking about building new applications. Okay. So what is MiServer? Well, the most important thing, at least when we started, was this idea of it being a set of cross-platform GUI controls. So it generates HTML5 JavaScript, and you should be able to render that on any platform. But of course, there are lots of people who prefer not to build their user interface in APL. I mean, there can be very good reasons for that. You might have a bunch of people who are very, very good at that. You might think that your chief actuary has better things to do than design user interfaces, and so on and so forth. So we think that as important as it is to give you tools to generate cross-platform GUI, because there will be people who need to do it all in APL, at least in the prototyping stage of an application, it is equally important to start to really make it sort of an industrial strength component of Dyalog APL to deliver web services. Right, that's that bullet point there. And that's where something we've been looking at for, I think, what is it, Brian? 7 years. Let me get back to the MiServer status in a bit.
Yeah, about that.
It's about 7 years, and we, like some of the presentations you saw earlier today, we looked at SOAP. So, as Joachim explained, there is something called Simple Access Protocol, and we could laugh. Then they officially changed that, so it just stood for SOAP. But that wasn't good enough. It's now actually disappearing, I think. SOAP is going to, again, it's one of these technologies that has so many tentacles out there in systems and official standards and requirements and so on that it's not going to go away immediately. So you will need probably to continue to be able to at least call SOAP services and maybe also provide them. It was XML based, and to make a function call, you would have all these headers and things that Joachim was talking about. The complexity of making a function call requires huge quantities of XML. Particularly, but this is actually one of the nice things about SOAP in a way, is that standard has something called Web Service Description Language, where any system that offered itself up as a web service had to provide this WSDL web document, which said, well, I have, for example, I have a function called regression, and it takes as input these things which have this name, occur a minimum of once, maximum once. It's a string. This one is an integer. And then you declare the type of result that you would get back from it. And what the C# people and the Java people and everybody else did was they built automatic code generators that would take a document like this and generate a C# class or a Java class, where the application programmer would just make an instance of that class and it would connect to the web service, and then they could make function calls for these types without really having to know anything about the underlying machinery. So the fact that the web service described itself in this way made it very, very easy to use, at least in the first instance. And then, as Joachim says, then they change the specification and your C# program stops working and you don't know when to recompile it, and so on and so forth. So in theory, it's great. In practice, all this SOAP stuff is just, it seems to be too heavy, and people are now moving away from it. But Dyalog, 7 years ago, I think it was, we built this thing we call the Standalone Web Service Framework, which is what Stefan was using for his first application. We called it Standalone Web Service Framework because it allowed you from APL, without IIS, Apache, or any other infrastructure, to build a very little web service that could provide the WSDL. So you would have your APL functions, and then you would do a little bit of work to describe them in the same way as if you were, I don't know if any of you built OLE servers. You basically had a way of saying, well, I have this function and it has these arguments and I have these types. and then SOARS would generate those massive XML documents, and the C# programmers and whoever wanted to use them would be happy. And we've seen some people use that very successfully. But this isn't something, unless we have people come to us now and say, you know, we really need more features, we're only supporting SOAP 1.1 and so on, we don't really see that we're going to spend a lot more time developing this technology. We think REST is where people want to go. What we are going to do, though, is probably get rid of SOARS as a standalone thing and roll it into MiServer, or at least give you the ability to do that, though we may rethink this because this Roomba work that has been done is really, as far as we can see, quite excellent. Well, as one would expect from Paul's hand. And he has done a lot of work to support HTTP protocols. And we may decide quite soon to use that as the basis for our tools like SOARS and MiServer. And then maybe there's a good case for keeping a very, very small SOARS built on top of Roomba, so that the people who want to use SOAP don't have to install the full MiServer framework to get that. But anyway, this talk is really about REST. And finally, we're getting to REST. So, you know, you can do research on what REST stands for, and it will tell you that it stands for representational state transfer, which isn't a phrase, Brian, that means anything to me. How would you explain that? Representational state transfer, what's that?
Basically, things are represented as resources, and you use the verbs to move things back and forth and change things.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's the best I can come up with. It's an amorphous term to me too.
Yeah. But in reality, it's like NoSQL. It's one of these terms. Really, it's not SOAP. It's sort of any other kind of web service where you're just doing simple HTTP transactions and you're transmitting a data payload, which originally when people were just moving away from SOAP, all the payloads were in XML. But now, as this JSON format, which is much more human readable, we'll see some of it in a moment if you haven't seen it before, JSON is taking over a sort of the data representation that everything on the web uses. So the WebSocket stuff we saw earlier was using these JSON messages to send data back and forth. The modern web services tend to use JSON. Dyalog has just added I-beams to convert easily between JSON and APL arrays, the same way we had Quad XML, or have Quad XML. And as Brian was saying, so this representational state transfer is about that you have these 6 verbs, so you get a resource, you add a new one, you replace, you delete. Head is a bit odd. That's the question about whether something exists, right, Brian?
Yes.
So a slightly strange name. And then you can ask for options. And then you identify the data in your application. You try and map the data structure that you have in your application into the URI. So rather than the URL being the name of a specific file that you're asking the web server for, it's a logical selection of data inside your application. So this would be the data for customer 123. And so here's an example. I don't know if that's readable at the back, but here's a very simple example of a. This is included on the USB that you have. So if you want to make a web page which is a service rather than something that renders HTML, instead of the compose function, you have a respond function. And it basically needs to, by default, it needs to return a namespace which contains some variables, which we will convert into JSON and send back as the payload for it. So this is an application that can either take a principal, a rate, and a term and calculate the payment, or it can take a rate, a term, and a payment and tell you what principal you can afford. And here's the actual application. There's these two lines of code doing the computation one way or the other. And then the code here is saying, well, get me the input parameters, print, rate, term, and payment. And then it checks to see which ones of them are empty. It validates that exactly one of them is missing. And then if it's the first one that's missing, if it's the principal, it computes the principal. And if it's the fourth one that's missing, it computes that. Otherwise, it just returns this message that says, provide one of these sets of parameters. And the way you would call that, well, actually, why don't we just switch to doing it live rather than showing slides. So this you should all be able to follow. If you've unzipped the MiServer into some folder, then I'll explain each one of these steps to you as we go. So you need to load the MiServer workspace from wherever you installed it. Right? I have it in C dev to MiServer. You need to remember where you installed it. Type that. And then don't start MS3, which is the demo application, but set this variable site. So you could also run this demo. The demo file is also included on the zip. So if you want to save the typing, all know how to run demo. So it's a user command. It takes the name of a text file containing a sequence of pre-entered APL expressions, and then you type Alt-N for next to call up the next line. You want to take a split? Is everybody?
I'm doing something else.
You're doing something else? Okay. So do people, who wants another second to try and get demo working, or nobody? So I'll just carry on, and you'll catch up if you can. So the second zip file that was on there was this folder called RESTful, which I've put in the dev RESTful. And then what we'll do, so what's in there is, so a My Site is typically just a folder. In here we have, you put all the application code that you want automatically loaded into the workspace when your application starts, into this folder called into the folder called code. Then when you start the MiServer, all of that stuff is loaded into the workspace. And this file here with the cryptic name BL is actually our business logic. And it has an initialization function that creates some customers, products, orders, and details, as you would expect. And then it has functions to add a customer, get a customer, update a customer, delete a customer, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to look at that in detail now. It has a cover class for the MiServer where you can have one of these override methods that Gil showed us right at the beginning of the day, where if you override on the server start, you can put in some code that gets run when the MiServer site is started. So we call BL init, which initializes our database in here. In the configuration, you need, if you want to run a RESTful site, you have to make a couple of, make sure you have a couple of settings in your configuration. In this case, we've needed the class name so that we could tell it which is the class that implements our server, so that that initialization code gets run. We've set RESTful to 1. Basically, setting RESTful to 1 means that when MiServer goes to look for a URI, instead of interpreting everything as a file name that it tries to go to, It interprets everything, Brian, is it correct? Everything except the last segment?
Well, everything except for the first segment is treated as the page name, and then everything else is a parameter to that.
Okay. So only the first segment is the page name, which loads some code, and then the rest of it is interpreted by your code. Did we just lose somebody?
We just got Fiona.
We got Fiona. Excellent. And then you have to make the list of the HTTP commands that you intend to support in your REST server. What is the default, Brian? Is it just get or?
Well, my server itself started out with just get and post.
Get and post, yeah.
Yep.
So you can have those. If you don't want to support the others, you can have them turned away at the pass by MiServer. Okay. So now I think we are ready to start the site. And so in Dyalog APL 14.1, we have these I-beams for converting from APL arrays to JSON and back, and they're still just I-beam. I think it'll probably be another release or two before we turn them into a system function. These will eventually become some kind of quad JSON function. But actually, before we use our own web service, I'd forgotten, I put in a little example here of showing how to call one of the many public web services that are out there. So this is one that Brian has found, which is the US Weather Service, which has a web service where you can give it a zip code, and you can say what sort of data format you want, and then we provide a function where you can have one of these verbs as the left argument, and then the URL and the parameters. Brian has looked it up. We can get the data back, and I'm passing it. This is an old style web service which returns XML data. So this thing returns a huge amount of data from the meteorological department, where we have some timestamps and we have some daily maximum, minimum temperature, probability, precipitation, and so on. So you can find these things on the internet. Some of them you have to pay for, others are free. Now, if this code that we looked at a moment ago, the mortgage web service, actually using WS as an abbreviation when writing these things is pretty confusing, right? Is that a workspace, a web service, a web socket? I keep getting confused, but this is the mortgage web service. And I just called it and I gave it no parameters. So of course it got annoyed at me and it just gave me this piece of JSON back saying, so this is the first element of the get is a return code. 0 means that from an HTTP point of view, this worked fine. We get some headers back, which tell us.
Actually, the zero is Conga thought it was fine. The headers, the HTTP return code, the 200 means HTTP thought it was fine.
You're right, yeah. This is the HTTP return code where 200 means it was fine. This is the Conga return code, which says that at the TCP level, everything worked fine. And then the third element is the data that came back, yeah, which is this JSON. So the message is an error message, and then there's an empty payment array, principal array, and a rate array. If we call it and give it some input parameters, then it picked up the principal, the rate, and the term, and it returned JSON where the message is empty, which is our indication that from our application point of view, everything was okay, and it's computed the payment and returned that to us. And the way you use this from JSON I-beam, the default, actually it's probably not the default, is it? In this case, we set from JSON to be a a left argument of 0, 1. I can't remember what the 1 is, but the 1 says take the JSON and turn it into a namespace. So in this last example here, we can say from JSON, the 3 pick, so get the JSON coming back from it, and then .pmt gives us this number that came back in the JSON. Yep. So there we're calling our... Right, so we looked at simple sample server before, just to show that it has that initialization logic. The MiServer page that implements this, which uses the business logic, is again a class that derives from RESTful. That means that it has access to some properties that are exposed by the RESTful base class, the most important one being the command. So when by the time our respond function is called, the base class has taken all the incoming HTTP requests apart, and it tells us what the command is, so we can select and decide whether to do a get, put, and so on. And it's also populated another parameter called underbar URI, which contains all the data segments from that. So the add let's see. Right, okay, but in this case, we're not actually using the URI to get the name, for example. We're using the get function. So the get function, which is in MiServer, which can be used both in a web service and in a web server page, will get the value of an incoming parameter. Whether it came on the command line using these notation with the question mark and the ampersand, whether it was included in the URL, or whether there was actually a post back and there was form content where there was a field in the form called name and there was a value. Inside your code, if you say get name, that will give you the value of name that was passed back from the browser, regardless of what the mechanism was for doing that. And this is sort of the part where we're still not quite happy, because if you compare to Core WC, you'd be sort of making a direct variable reference to data that was automatically bound. As the user types, the value of a variable is changing. And that's what we'd like to get right in the next version of MiServer. Do data binding of the nature that you were playing with, Gil, in your example, so that we'll be able to do data binding between your variables in some namespace. You'll declare that this namespace binds to some Angular JS structure or something like that. And then we'll also need WebSocket support for that, of course. Build it into MiServer, and then you'll be able to make changes in the server code and push them down to the client at any time. And also any changes made by the user in the user interface will just come back without necessarily having post events and so on that you have to sort of generate at a higher level. But for web services, I guess that's irrelevant. You wouldn't be using data binding there because they really are RPC calls at the end of the day. So this customer example is also there, and that's, I think, Brian, this is complete, right? You implement every single one of the verbs. That's correct. On this data structure. So we can add, delete, and so on. And in each case, what's in this class is really just selecting, getting the data that's required as the arguments, and then inside each one of these functions, there's a call to the business logic function, get customer, which actually goes and looks at that data structure that was populated by the init function.
Yeah, the idea behind this was to show an example of grafting a RESTful interface to an existing application.
to an existing well-structured application which had a nice API.
Yes. There are so many of those floating out there.
Yeah, there are so many of those out there. So this should be very, very easy. So there's a function in here called show, which shows us what's in this database. Unfortunately, not designed for a very, very small screen, but I mean, this is, you know, another one of those order details, products, applications. We've looked at that. Okay. Yeah, this is a problem that we've been struggling with in Conga. So this is really an aside for those of you who've been using Conga for a while. The problem here is that IPv6 support has been very slowly making its way out into the world. And initially we had the problem where if the server didn't specify whether it wanted to use IPv6 or IPv4, it would ask Windows which was available, and if Windows said IP6 was available, it would bind to that, but then there'd be a whole bunch of cases where that just didn't work. So in all of our samples, I think the MiServer, if you don't change the configuration, a MiServer will start using IPv4 only as the default. It's easy to change in the configuration. But my laptop, when the client asks whether IPv4 or IPv6 is available, it's told that IPv6 is available, and it tries that first, because when it asks what's localhost, I think the first address that it gets back is an IPv6 address. And then suddenly you get, well, I can't connect to localhost. Come on, you must be kidding. And the solution to that is to tell Conga to use IPv4, in this case, at least. Then you have to go back and do it again. Oops. Right, so we said go and get customer, and but the verb was options, right? So we said go to the customer web service and ask for the options, and Brian has very kindly given us this nice text output then, which says, well, this is how you use this web service. So you don't have the WSDL, but the nice thing to do would be to, for the option command, output something like this so that people can understand how they should use your web service. There are standards. I don't know, Brian, if you've looked at any of them, but there are standards for RESTful Web Service description language, but I think the problem is there are 4 or 5 different standards.
Yeah, WADL seems to, WADL seems to be the predominant one that I've seen. Okay.
But I don't know, I mean, Joachim, have you looked at that? Have you looked at REST at all?
Yes, we've looked at REST for the new interface I talked about at the end.
Yeah.
I think the original idea of REST is that you're supposed to get, it's supposed to be like hypertext, so you're supposed to get links in the initial reply you get back, and then you can follow those links to get more information.
Yeah, and I think Brian has even done that. We'll see that in a second.
Okay, yeah. But otherwise, there are some...
but what about
we haven't looked at those like WADL and that sort of stuff. Our current idea is to map our existing API, which is exposed via Conga and APL command mode, fairly closely, but rename stuff so that we don't have to maintain 2 different.
Because I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I get the impression that JSON, I mean, JSON is coming out of JavaScript, right? It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And the people who like JSON are the people who are using dynamic languages. I mean, JavaScript is identical to APL in that respect, that it says a number is a number. There are only 2 types, right? There's text and numbers and objects. So it's coming out of a dynamic language tradition where you don't declare types that in that much detail. So it's much more APL-like, much more APL-friendly way of doing things. Okay, so if we get customer, then we get back the return code, we get back some headers, and we get back the data. which is one of these JSON things. And if we pass that through from JSON, we get back an array of JSON objects, because you can see the curly brackets. There's one here, that's an object which has some properties. But that's an array of customers. So if this is a vector, and if we go into each item and we say, get me the customer ID, the customer name, and the customer URI, then Brian has done exactly what he's supposed to be doing, and he returns a URI for that customer that you could then follow and go and oh, okay, so to JSON, just pretty printing it. It's not. If you turn it back into JSON with the options that we've got there, it formats it nicely. So we can then go and get an individual customer. The format JSON function that we set up before just converts to JSON and back. So it just pretty prints it, so we don't get that long string that's very difficult to read. We can go and get the orders for a customer. Yeah, I mean, this is fairly obvious what's happening here. Get an individual order back, order number 9, and so on and so forth. Get a non-existent customer, you get an error message back. 404 not found is how you're supposed to handle that. Insert a new customer, so do a post, and the parameters. Update a customer using the put command, changing the name. And we can see now that customer number 400 is now called Dan. Can't remember what he was called before.
Daniel.
Daniel. Ah, right. There we go. Daniel has been renamed to Dan. And we can delete a customer. And we can see that we got the confirmation there that it was okay. And is this a norm, Brian, that when you delete something, you give back the data for that customer, or is that just your choice?
That was my choice.
Yeah. So that's not a standard. And verify that he's gone. Yeah. Let's see, what was I can't remember what this was about. Okay, there's a function in here called getQuote. No, this is never mind that example. Just another example which you can look at in there of getting. I think that's actually just getting some JSON data from a website that isn't really a web service. It's just a website where if you go to URL with some input parameters, it gives you some JSON. But I mean, when is something a web service and when isn't it, right? I mean, if you say get with the URL and you get some JSON back and it contains the data that you want, then it's a web service, right?
Is that the definition?
Well, Brian found. Let's see, where did we have that somewhere here? Brian found this in some government glossary somewhere, which just says automated information services over the internet using standardized technologies and formats protocols that simplify the exchange and integration of data over the internet. Then it's a web service. If it does that, it's a web service. So let's see, we looked at all this, we saw these verbs, we talked about all of these. I think so the first two are general, whether you're building a web page or a web service. You have these page data, which contains a namespace containing data that you can retrieve with this get function. You've got the command, so you can see which HTTP command was used to retrieve the page. And then if it's a RESTful, if it derives from the RESTful base class, then it also has this URI thing. So Brian, the RESTful class, essentially what it does is it adds this URI and then it has the automatic formatting of the result as JSON. What else does it do?
Yes.
Is that sort of basically what it does that's different from what a web server page would do?
It exposes a couple of methods to make it easier. For instance, if you notice, the options verb returns text as opposed to JSON. So we expose a couple of methods to make it easier to do things like change your content type, set headers, things that you'd be more likely to do in a web service environment than in the typical MyPage environment.
Yeah, we talked about the configuration. At the moment, you have to go into the configuration for your site. And as it says here, we really recommend that you do this in the server XML file for your site. There's a server XML file for the MiServer installation. And then for each one of your site folders, there's another one. And we really recommend that you add this RESTful command at the site level rather than setting your entire MiServer installation to be RESTful. But we're also, the RESTful stuff is really quite new, and we're still wondering actually whether we need this configuration parameter. We might be able to say something that, well, if you give a URL like this, there isn't a file called that, then have a look to see whether there's something called person that derives from the RESTful base class. And then that particular page is then just a RESTful web service, rather than having to set RESTful for the whole site. That would allow you to more easily integrate, have a site that has some pages and some.
I was going to say my little fork there, I changed it from a flag to actually naming the pages that I wanted to act as RESTful handlers.
Naming them differently. Actually, no, Brian, that's not a bad idea, is it?
Rather than setting RESTful, to have a REST parameter that names the pages that you want to act as RESTful handlers.
Yeah. Actually, this is something you may not have seen yet, that we've changed the extension for MiServer pages so that it's no longer .dialog. In the last week or so, it's now .mypage, and I guess it might make sense to have a .restful or .myrest or something like that. Yeah. Okay, so I think we've said all these things, except a couple of things. At the bottom here. So REST is supposed to be stateless. Though, of course, exactly what that means isn't clear. Of course, if you have parameters, session parameters that identify you, then, of course, your server can implement any kind of state that you want. But you need to be, you can use cookies, right, Brian, with...
Yes. Mostly what I've seen in my research is that suppose you run a query that would generate a list of, a few thousand items, and it gives them back to you 10 at a time, or 100 at a time. You wouldn't, if you were to have implement a command that says, give me the next chunk, that would violate REST's stateless goal. So you actually need to provide, give it a URL that points to that next chunk, not, not give it a command that says give me the next chunk.
Okay, so you would need to have a URI that said, somehow give me records number 11 to 20. Somehow it's in the URI, and then okay. And then there's, we could have a discussion about this now. Stefan's question about authentication. So if you want to have user authentication of either web services or web pages, think MiServer implements the sort of very simple, very primitive, is it based on plain text, user ID and password, Brian? I don't remember. The simple authentication, which is something that you might use just for a demo, but you wouldn't really want to use in a production system. The state-of-the-art solution would be using things like integrated Windows authentication. If you have a Windows domain server, you could somehow, I mean, Conga has calls which would allow the server side to have a short conversation with your client to establish the identity of who's at the other end. But how you would do that over HTTP, I'm not sure. Would you need WebSockets, Björn, to be able to do that?
Yeah.
If we had WebSockets, then we'd be able to implement that. The state-of-the-art solution is probably to issue certificates to your users if you can get your IT organization to do that. But we haven't met, well, we have one customer who's implementing that at the moment, right?
Yeah.
Other organizations, you talk to them about, say, well, you know, you should issue certificates to all your users, and they'll say, yes, we know that, but we're not ready to do that yet. It's still, how many people here have, you know, corporate certificates? One. Yeah. So everybody knows that that's where they should be going, but nobody's really been able to get their act together to do that. I don't know, Stefan, is that something that you might be able, you think your IT department is ready to do, at least for 5 users? Because it's like a pretty big administrative hassle to set that up. You have to get registered as a certificate authority. And
you don't have to do that. You can have self-certified certificate.
Yeah, okay, you don't have to do that.
We use that in one system.
Yeah.
Because that's where they said, like, for each machine has its own certificate. So this is not the users, but machines.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Björn has done some work with self-signed certificates. So if you think you'd like to do that, if you'd like to set up a small application and generate your own certificates, it's not very difficult to do that, right? You can quite easily do that. And Conga and MiServer support secure sockets. So you could take a certificate and put it on each of the client machines. And when you make your web service connections, you can have a secure socket created where the information about that certificate is given to the server. It can be 100% sure that it's, you know, it's cryptographically proven that that's that machine. If it's just a certificate that doesn't prove who is sitting at the machine, then you need a certificate which is integrated in such a way that before the certificate can be activated, the user has to type in a PIN or has some kind of physical token to activate it. But again, those devices are becoming quite common, right? Björn, you said you found one on the internet yesterday that cost like 20 euros or 25 euros. So you can have a device that has the certificates on. The user plugs it into a USB port. They have to type something, right? PIN code to activate it. And then I think you have a pretty secure system, though Sava is dying to tell us something about it.
Like you can have, when you call certificates, you can have some like certificate with a PIN all the time.
Yeah.
You can have like a kind of feeder, I think. That use, for example, for Chrome, and you could have something, I think 6 euros is the cheapest one that you plug in USB. And okay, you have to activate. This is only without the PIN. 25 is the that you have to type. Also.
With a PIN, yeah.
Yeah, I think you have
of course, if you're using Windows, you can have certificates that are in secure storage that is only available to the user when the user is logged in. So you say if you can trust your users to log in and not leave their terminals unattended, then you know they have logged into the Windows machine. But I think for really secure applications, you are going to want a physical device. Yeah. Yep. So to conclude, it's an open source project. This is a sort of general thing we're trying to do now with all of the new tools that Dyalog builds. we're putting them up as open source projects on GitHub. So although we can't open source the APL interpreter yet, we're trying to open source all of the APL code, all of the new APL code that we're writing, so that you can inspect it and at least, maybe you will contribute it. We have one user I would like to publicly recognize, Michael Bass. He has actually written a couple of the widgets that you can use already. The font awesome stuff is his work, and a couple of other things. And we can see that there are people, he wanted that for his own application. He's building an application in MiServer, and we can see that we're starting to get some of this synergy that has been missing from the APL community in the past. So please, at least feed back to us whether you like it or not. Build some sample applications and put them up there. Also important to say that very, very important thing for Dyalog now is, we added support for Mac OS X. We can see Android support in the future. We're not ready to put dates on any of these yet because we don't think they're urgent. But within the next few years, we want to have Dyalog APL available on all the platforms that are likely to become important eventually. And all of the tools that we build, things like MiServer, the cryptographic work that we do, we try and implement it if at all possible so that it works identically on all the platforms. So the next couple of things that are related to this that we're thinking seriously about now is using Roomba, because we think it looks really good. So throw away the lower levels of MiServer and get some of the benefits of HTTP 2.0 and other stuff that's been implemented there. Data binding, is it Angular that's the hot up and coming thing now, or is it already peaked and looking?
I don't know. I'm judging by
these technologies come and go so fast. It's quite scary.
I think Angular is not the hot and up and coming. That's React.
React.
Yeah.
Is it better?
Angular has recently come up with version 2, which is a good sign of it.
2.0, that's where these frameworks start to fade, isn't
exactly.
it? And they're already
so
time to move on.
Well.
I think sorry?
2 years ago it was Knockout, then Angular, and now React. Okay, so
yeah. But whatever we do at Dyalog, we'll be trying to hide that, so that. But I guess that's not really possible. Or maybe it is. Yeah, if we're generating the JavaScript, we can maybe hide it from you completely. We're in control of both ends of this. And then at the Conga level, try and actually take away some of the stuff that's in Roomba that's been really hard work for Paul to do, and where he can't really get the same performance in APL as if we were to pull that down into the C layer. So the WebSocket support, and then actually putting support for HTTP commands into Conga, so that you don't have, at the moment, if you look inside the Conga APL code, it's looping around on if HTTP GET, we have a function. It's looping around looking at the HTML that's coming in to try and decide whether you've reached the end of an HTTP command. And the support for secure features, support for certificate stores and so on. The underlying, we've had support for that for what, again, 3, 4 years? 5 years, probably.
A while.
Yeah, a while. Very few people have actually been using it. But we think that's going to change very soon. I think that the requirement for you to write secure applications is about to break loose. Fortunately, the tool layers that Björn builds upon are also much improved now. And we'll be putting some of that into Conga. So, I managed to use up half of the extra time that we had.
Well done.
Unless there are lots of questions remaining.
Well, I got one comment from Paul Mansour saying there are HTTP range requests in the headers. You can specify a range to retrieve. So he hasn't got that much more to say about it. As
part of REST or HTTP?
As part of the HTTP layer. So
in 2.0.
No, in 1.1.
In 1.1, okay, yeah, well,
But
we're,
that's for resuming downloads and the like, so if you know you've already.
oh, okay,
chunk of a file.
right, okay, so it's at that level, yeah.
It's at that. Well, I don't know if you can define different ranges. There's different ranges you can define if it's a byte range, or presumably you can specify a different measure. I'm not sure. I haven't checked.